Okay, everybody. Let's go ahead and make your way to a seat so we can get the next session started. All right. What a wonderful day. I mean, we are all very fortunate to be able to spend some time listening to Director Beasley talk about his work and the work of the World Food Program around the globe. And it's not over. You're about to meet some of my dear friends who are experts in this space, and they're going to teach us a lot more. So if you have a pen and piece of paper, you're going to want it. If you don't, put your phone on record. We will have all these sessions available on our website at hungerandpoverty.org. And we have people all over the country that are watching along with us today. Well, right now, we're going to hear remarks from a friend of mine, Adam Phillips, who is the Director of Faith-Based Initiatives at USAID. In a fitting way, he's in Rome. And so he prepared some remarks for us that we're going to hear now.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Nicholas Phillips, and I am the Director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and of the Local Faith and Transformative Partnerships Hub at USAID. Thanks to Jeremy Everett and the rest of the team at the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty who invited me to speak and help organize today's event. I so wish I could be with you all in person, but I'm on my way to the G20 Interfaith Summit in Bologna, Italy, and am very grateful to at least share some brief recorded remarks. Prior to joining USAID, I spent my career as a pastor and a grassroots advocate, championing inclusion and service to and with people living in poverty and hunger. Through my work at the One Campaign, World Vision, Bread for the World, and many other faith-inspired initiatives, I've witnessed the tremendous impact that religious leaders and faith-based organizations can have in healing communities in need. At USAID, I want to champion that work by continuing the 20-year legacy of the agency's faith-based office to build bridges between the federal government and faith communities. Working at the intersection of faith and action has given me a unique insight into and privilege, really, to forge relationships with humanitarians, activists, and development professionals across the religious and political spectrums. I've seen firsthand that we can do amazing things together. Partnership offers us the chance to model a new paradigm that embracing pluralism and advancing development goals, we can help address the devastating impacts of today's development and humanitarian challenges in our nation and in our world. Turning to the topic of today's event, I want to share the various ways in which USAID will work with faith-based organizations to combat global hunger. Faith-based organizations, both local and international, serve populations in some of the most vulnerable contexts in the world. They are often the first in and the last to leave, if not permanently embedded in communities coping with development and humanitarian challenges. As a result, faith-based organizations often hold positions of special trust and provide essential social support in societies wary of their own government and outsiders. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted this phenomenon. Organizations such as Islamic Relief, Catholic Relief Services, Samaritan's Purse, World Vision, and their hundreds of dedicated counterparts have swiftly built upon their established networks to develop response systems, much as they did in previous global health crises like Ebola and Zika. Their long-standing connections with hospitals, clinics, local leadership, and most importantly, communities and families have made them the go-to resource for information, basic needs, and of course, emotional and spiritual support. My nutrition colleagues in the agency have reminded me that COVID-19 threatens to reverse a decade of global nutrition progress and has put millions more lives at risk. Current projections estimate that by 2022, an additional 13.6 million children could suffer from wasting or acute malnutrition, and 3.6 million more children could face stunted growth that limits their lifelong potential. The additional burden of childhood malnutrition and child mortality could result in future productivity losses of upwards of $29.7 billion US. As the world looks to rebuild from the economic impacts of COVID-19, it cannot afford this immense loss in productivity. With the Nutrition for Growth Summit just around the corner, the nutrition community has a pivotal moment to demonstrate commitment to safeguard progress and combat child malnutrition in the context of the pandemic. This critical alignment demonstrates the unique opportunities governments and religious leaders have to collaborate around the shared concerns of child malnutrition and access to clean water and sanitation, and to model evidence-based, solution-oriented engagement between government and civil society. We recognize the long road ahead of us, and we are determined to work as efficiently as possible with local communities and leaders. Faith-based organizations and leaders are embedded in the areas that need the most humanitarian assistance, and as such, should be engaged to tackle these challenges. My office is in the process of creating the first of its kind faith engagement policy. It will build upon the agency's efforts to strengthen the evidence base on religious engagement and development, and ensure we work with individuals and organizations embedded in local communities to create sustainable solutions. It will also strengthen our relationship with mission staff on the ground, as well as between the missions and faith communities in the region. We will soon have a public comment period, and we're eager to hear your feedback on this really groundbreaking policy that we hope to create. Furthermore, we have recently relaunched the Sector Council on Strategic Religious Engagement and International Religious Freedom. It includes membership across the agency to integrate a USAID-wide approach to religious engagement, and will be the coordinating body to work with the incoming ambassador at large for international religious freedom at the Department of State. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak today. I really do hope that I can visit Baylor and the community soon in the months ahead, and I wish you all good health and peace.
Awesome. Adam has become a good friend, and the work that he is doing is important work. One of our students asked a question, about going from the grassroots reality. A student that had lunch with David Beasley. How do we go from a grassroots reality to running organizations like the one you're in? Well, Adam is representative of that. He's a grassroots organizer. Who stayed at it and really learned the power of policy, and ended up in a role that is one of the senior most roles at USAID, and so we're grateful to have them as a partner. Well, this week, USDA released its 2020 food insecurity numbers, and so every year they release their food security numbers. And what we found in 2020, when we were all wondering were food insecurity numbers going to be off the chart, what ended up happening is they leveled out. They were not much different than 2019. And why was that? Why in the world, knowing that we saw the long lines at food banks on the news, we know that families had widespread economic disruption, how did we stave off significant hunger in America? Well, it's because the nonprofit sector and the government sector and the corporate sector came together to throw everything and the kitchen sink at addressing food insecurity during this pandemic, and it worked. It worked to help stabilize the realities that many families face on a day-to-day basis, living with the realities of broken social systems. And many of these families bear the weight of these broken social systems, all of them, whether it's access to health care or good paying jobs, vaccines, or food. So that happened because we had people that were willing to step up with a day's notice, people like Denton McLane. And so I'd like Denton to come up. Denton serves as the chairperson or chairman of McLane Global. And he's been a good partner and a good friend. And so Denton, come on up.
I'm sorry I'm not as tall as Jeremy. Jeremy, thank you for this opportunity, and also thank you for not including me on the list of warlords and terrorists that you had to deal with in the program this last year. But isn't Governor Beasley an inspiration? I just found his talk inspiring. In this day and age, all we hear, you turn on the TV, or as he referenced, you look at your phone, all you hear is what's wrong, why we're divided, and why things aren't working. And it's just great to hear some optimism, some idealism, and someone who has the courage to lead with their Christian faith. So much appreciated to him. The family had a long experience in the professional baseball industry. In a couple of years after my father bought the Houston Astros, someone asked him, what was the biggest thing you've learned from being outside the industry to learning about it? And he thought for a minute, and I heard him say, well, when I was outside of the industry, I'd read the sports page at the end of every day, and it would talk about what happened at the game or what's happening in sports. And then I got in the sports industry, and I realized it's two different things of the reality versus what you read in the paper. But he said at the same time, now after seeing the sports page, I can only imagine how the front page gets made. And I think today, through Governor Beasley's comments, we saw a lot of the behind the scenes of how much coordination and effort it takes to make this world a better place, and how much it's not going to happen on its own. We all have to work together to get that done. The McLane family and McLane Global was extremely proud to be able, when Jeremy asked if we would sponsor this event. We very much enjoyed the relationship we've had. McLane Global is a unique business. We work on two angles. First is we're sourcers of food product. We will source all around the world, in the USA or anywhere, for what the customer specifications are for what food product they're looking for. And after you find the product and then you negotiate the price, then becomes the hard part. How do you move the product from the factory to ultimately where the end consumer is or where the retail point is? So the point of this business, we work across around the world with retailers of food, convenience stores, food service wholesalers, and have done this for over 50 years in this business. But a unique opportunity started coming our way as we started developing this network. Right around 2006, 2007, financial collapse time, we started having customers call and asking for food product that was different than everyone we had had before. It was the food banks of Houston, Austin, and Dallas. And we said, first, obviously, yes, we're a for-profit business. We'd love to assist you in any way profitable. But we started digging in a little bit more and started saying, well, why are they here and what is moving? And there was a lot moving in the hunger relief segment at that point in time. But what we ultimately learned was there was no wholesaler that worked to this industry. There's different wholesalers that work in convenience and grocery, as well as hotel and restaurant. And when it makes a great headline and the product's already there, they'll support their local food banks. But when it comes to being proactive, looking to the next quarter, what can we buy to drive down the cost of product so then the food bank can stretch their dollar further? There was no one speaking to that. And we said, hey, that's something we can do. And so over the course of the last 15 years, we've started working with over 200 food banks across the country, helping them buy not only commodity product, but also getting into value-added product, backpack programs, senior feeding programs, things like that. And really started seeing that not only could we use our network for profitable private industry gain, but we could also use it to help create a better place. And as we were doing that, the most unfortunate thing happened. My brother met Jeremy Everett first. So through all this, I have my brother constantly reminding me I owe all of this to him, which, Drayton, we're very proud of you. Thank you, sir. But he met Jeremy, and after talking to Jeremy for a few minutes, he saw Jeremy's heart and what they were trying to do and said, you need to talk to my brother. They've got a lot going on at McLane Global. And ever since then, there was no crawl or walk. We've been running ever since. And so the thing that I appreciate the most out of Jeremy is that it is truly, as everyone has mentioned, he brings everyone to the table, from faith-based to hunger relief to for-profit to government. All in, everybody's at the table, rolling up their sleeves, saying, what can we do? How can we reach a little bit further to solve a problem? So very excited for Jeremy today and asking us to be involved. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Appreciate him reading it, that statement at the end that I wrote for him, and so thank you, Denton. Now for our expert panelist. Our expert panelist session is going to be moderated by Dr. Jenny Howe. Jenny is the inaugural director of the Program for Theology, Ecology, and Food Justice here at Truett Seminary at Baylor. The TEFJ program trains master's level students at the intersection of systemic issues related to the ecological crisis, the challenges of food justice, and the Christian doctrine and formation. Because of Jenny's leadership with her colleague, Dr. Dennis Tucker, Truett Seminary and the Baylor Collaborative will be launching a master's degree in theology, ecology, and food justice next fall, pending Regent approval this November. So Regents, if you're listening, make sure that you approve that. This will be our opportunity to educate and train the next generation of leaders working with organizations like the World Food Program and McLane Global to end hunger. Jenny earned her bachelor's degree from Texas A&M, a Master of Divinity from Duke Divinity School, a PhD in theology and ethics from Baylor. Her academic scholarship focuses on the connections between land, racism, theology, amid a whole host of other things. In addition to her role at Baylor, Jenny serves as a theologian in residence at the World Hunger Relief Farm, a regenerative farm teaching center outside of Waco, Texas. Jenny is married to Reverend Eric Howe, my pastor. They have 3 children, Laura, Lily, and Jimmy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jenny Howe.
I'd like to echo Dean Still and welcome all of you here to Truett, and echo Dr. Tucker this morning, who said we hope that it feels like a welcome home. It's my privilege today to introduce you to our panel of experts. I am very excited and honored to share the stage with these 3 individuals. The first is Dr. Victor Inahosa. He's Associate Professor of Political Science in the Honors Program at Baylor, and he leads the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty's efforts regarding migration and global hunger. In addition to scholarly articles, he is also the author of the book, A Journey Towards Hope. This is a book written for children, chronicling the lives of 4 Central American children fleeing violence and making the arduous journey to the United States. Also joining us is Asma Latif. And Asma is the Policy and Advocacy Lead for the Sdg2 Advocacy Hub. What is that, you might ask? Well, you're going to find out today. It's an initiative to coordinate action to end hunger and malnutrition and achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 2. She has extensive experience in policy advocacy and coalition building, and most recently served as director of Bread for the World Institute. And finally, we have Dr. Elsa Morano. Dr. Morano is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Strategic Initiatives at Texas A&M University, where she previously served as president. Now, this is my alma mater, and so I think it's also worth noting that she was the first female president of Texas A&M, and only. She was a member of the George W. Bush administration, where she served as Undersecretary for Food Safety at the United States Department of Agriculture. This is the highest-ranking food safety official in the U.S. government. So why don't you come on up, and we will begin our conversation. You ready for this? Okay. Well, I'm a theologian. I am not an expert in all of these areas for sure, but I thought that I might begin our conversation by framing it with a letter that just came out this past week. Some of you may have seen this. It's a pretty extraordinary letter in that it was jointly written by Pope Francis, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, and Archbishop of Canterbury Justin. So the world leaders of the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and the Anglican Church. This letter that they wrote, I'm just going to read you a couple of excerpts because I think it sets up well what we have to talk about today. Together they wrote, "Over the course of the pandemic, we have learned how vulnerable we are. Our social systems frayed, and we found that we cannot control everything. We must acknowledge that the ways we use money and organize our societies have not benefited everyone. We find ourselves weak and anxious, submersed in a series of crises: health, environmental, food, economic, and social, which are all deeply interconnected." The letter goes on to call us to work together. And they say, if we think of humanity as a family and work together towards a future based on the common good, we could find ourselves living in a very different world. Together, we can share a vision for life where everyone flourishes. Together, we can choose to act with love, justice, and mercy. Together, we can walk towards a fairer and fulfilling society with those who are most vulnerable at the center. This is quite a charge. And I think one of the things that they do so well in this letter is they name the complexity of the issues that we are addressing. When people are starving to death, there are many reasons why that is happening. And so today, I want to bring the three of you together to talk about that complexity and how we need to begin thinking about how we approach the challenges that we are living in right now in 2021. So Asma, I'd like to begin with you. And perhaps you could, in your own words, describe, first of all, the work that you do.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jeremy and Grace, for inviting me to be part of this hopefully annual Forum on Global Hunger here at Baylor. It's so great to be in person after a year and a half of Zooming, as much as I've appreciated that, but it's really nice to see all of you in person, and thank you for that question. So I work for an initiative called the Sdg2 Advocacy Hub, which is quite a mouthful, but it's really focused on ending hunger by 2030. And it's goal 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in 2015. We're already through 2021. I was going to say 5 years ago, but longer. We've got a bit more than 8 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The goals were adopted at a time when there was a lot of optimism about the prospect of ending hunger. We had had about a decade of consistent decline in hunger when these goals were adopted. And so world leaders gathered. Pope Francis actually spoke that day when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And they agreed on a set of very ambitious goals to end poverty, to end hunger, to end all forms of malnutrition, and to do it in a comprehensive way. So SDG2 is one of 17 goals. And the 17 goals really speak to some of the complexity. The SDGs are really a recognition that you need to make progress on multiple fronts in order to leave no one behind, to protect the planet, and to make sure that we can all be prosperous at the same time. So there are 17 goals. They cover the gamut: education, gender equality, cities, livable cities, climate change, equity, oceans, protecting the oceans, you name it. They're in those goals. The 17th goal is about partnership, how we are all needed to work together to move forward on these goals. SDG2, the hunger goal, and that's the one I've spent my entire career on and feel extremely passionate about, so I should back up a little bit. The SDGs followed a set of goals that were called the Millennium Development Goals. They were adopted in 2000. Those were 8 goals. We went from 8 to 17. There was no hunger goal. Hunger and poverty were grouped together in Goal 1 of the Millennium Development Goals. And so SDG2 is a recognition that we need to focus on hunger independently of other goals because it was getting left behind. We weren't making sufficient progress. And the SDG expands the way we think about hunger. When you're thinking about ending hunger, it's not sufficient to talk about calorie intake of people. You really need to think about the other aspects. So SDG2 has 5 targets. So the first is about calories. It's about adequate. It's about zero hunger, so nobody is going to bed hungry. The second target is ending all forms of malnutrition. So that's stunting, wasting, obesity, because there's a recognition that malnutrition undermines your ability to live life to your fullest potential. For children who are malnourished, they're more likely to die. And then if they survive, it affects their whole life. They have lifelong health crises that affect their ability to learn. And if you're not able to learn well in school, you're not able to earn well as an adult. And so you're stuck in that spiral of poverty. The third element of SDG2 is about doubling the livelihood, the income and productivity of smallholder farmers. Again, a recognition that the people who are actually growing our food were the ones who were being left behind. So we named it in that goal. The fourth element is about agricultural sustainability, that our agricultural systems need to really be done in a sustainable way. And then the fifth is about biodiversity and ensuring biodiversity. So SDG2 itself was a recognition that we have to look at multiple aspects. We cannot just be focusing on one if we're going to end hunger. Agricultural sustainability is key. If you're not able to continue to grow your food because the environment has been damaged, then people will be hungry. So it was this very interconnected way, and SDG2 was embedded in these 17 goals because it's recognizing that girls can't be educated unless they're well nourished. So SDG2 was the second goal because of the importance it is to achieving all the other goals. So I'll stop there and we can get to other things.
Okay, yes, I have some follow-up questions in a moment. But first, Elsa, I think maybe we should turn to you next. I think Asma set us up well for you explaining a little bit about the work that you do. And I failed to mention in the introduction that you have, until just recently, been the director of the Borlaug Institute at Texas A&M University. This is an institute that focuses on sustainable agriculture. And so perhaps you could talk a little bit about your work there at the Borlaug Institute.
I'd be glad to. Thank you very much. And it's an honor to be with my friends here, all of you. Peace cannot be built on empty stomachs or on human misery. You know who said that? Another Nobel Prize winner. This time it was Dr. Norman Borlaug in 1970. Those of you who may not have heard of Dr. Borlaug, he was an agricultural scientist. He was a plant breeder from Iowa and went to school at the University of Minnesota and went to work at an international research institute for maize and wheat in Mexico. And what he did in the 1960s is he developed a variety of wheat that grew really, really well in parts of the world that were starving to death at that time: India, Pakistan, Mexico. He introduced that variety of wheat, and he's been credited for having saved 2 billion lives by his work. So he got the Nobel Peace Prize. He later was given the Congressional Medal of Honor the Presidential Medal of Science, and on and on. What was the key to what he did? Is his realization that, as he said it, peace cannot be built on empty stomachs or on human misery. If we don't address hunger, and this is a global hunger meeting that we're at, hunger is tied to many of the ills that we see around the world, be it conflict, be it migration. Certainly, as Asma was talking about stunting, do you know that a third of children under the age of 5 around in developing countries are stunted? And for those of you who may not know what that means, it means that your brain never developed when your mom had you in the womb, and then as you are a newborn baby up until age of 2 or so. So you can never reach your potential. I've met a young man who was 18 years old, and there he was in a classroom, in a kindergarten classroom in Ethiopia, because he had been stunted, and so even though he grew up as a young man, but his brain was that of a kindergartner, okay? A tragedy, because imagine when something like that happens, that person cannot reach their potential. They can never be what they were gonna be or do what they were gonna do. So Dr. Borlaug believed very much that hunger was the kind of the spoke of the wheel, and then you have all of the different, or the center of the wheel, and then you have all the different aspects, such as Asma mentioned, education and economy and many other things, many equality, gender equality, for example. So all of those things are related, but it starts with hunger, okay? So what are we to do about hunger? We heard very eloquent remarks by Director Beasley, of course. You know, he's in the middle of a storm. You know, he feeds hungry people. That's what the World Food Program does. So what do the rest of us do, okay? And how can we help make those efforts be sustainable? Because what you don't want to happen is to forever, as he kind of alluded to, be providing help, and nothing ever changes, okay? You want to be able to make a difference, to stop what's the cause, the root causes, if you will. And so that's where policy comes in. That's where a lot of things come in. I wanted to tell you just a brief story that I think kind of tells the example of what can happen. We at the Borlaug Institute, the Norman Borlaug Institute for International Agriculture and Development at Texas A&M, many years ago, some of you may know that the country of Rwanda in the 1990s underwent a horrific episode, a genocide, where hundreds of thousands of people were murdered in a matter of a few months by their neighbors with machetes. Heads were chopped off, all because of a corrupt government that incited that violence in people, okay? And why did it incite the violence in people? Because things were not going well in the country. People were hungry, people were poor, and so the government decided, you know, let's blame those people over there, so go get them, okay? Kind of what happened in Nazi Germany, if you think about it, right? So anyway, after the genocide was over, thank goodness, we received some funding to do a project in Rwanda, and it was supposed to help, you know, farmers in general and so forth. And we decided, no, let's focus on one particular crop, coffee, because coffee is such an important crop. If you look at a map of the world, all the developing countries in the world, the poorest countries in the world, are in what they call the coffee belt, is where coffee is produced. And certainly Rwanda was one of those. And so we decided, let's help the country of Rwanda. Let's get the women farmers, because all their husbands had been murdered, put them together into a cooperative of women farmers, train them on how to effectively and efficiently grow the coffee plants, and when to pick the cherries so that they would be at the highest level of quality. Make a long story short, enable them to be able to connect to a market. And as a result, the economy of Rwanda was transformed. And Rwandan coffee is one of the best coffee, specialty coffees, you know, whether you go to Starbucks or wherever, Rwandan coffee is primo coffee. And so we've done the same thing or tried to, in other countries around the world, developing countries, focused on coffee, but sometimes on other kinds of crops that are potentially good for people to elevate them out of poverty. Because we have discovered that if we elevate them out of poverty, we elevate them out of hunger. They're able to do that. And so years later, we went back to Rwanda on a completely different project. The country was doing pretty well, but certainly not where we wanted it to be. And this was there was a private company. This is where private industry comes in. Private company, SC Johnson. I don't know if you know who they are. They're the ones who make Raid and all kinds of pesticides, insecticides. They have a line of all-natural pesticides that use an essential oil called pyrethrum that you get out of a flowering plant. And turns out that they were procuring it from Australia, and Australia had some issues one season, and so they needed a different supplier, and they knew that in Rwanda, that flower grows wild. So they contacted us because we had been in Rwanda in the coffee project, and they said, can you go into Rwanda, you have contacts with farmer groups and all of that, and help them produce these flowers, efficiently. And so we did that. We got the farmers into cooperatives. Make a long story short, they would pick then the flowers, dry them, and sell the flowers to the government of Rwanda, which was a partner. And the government of Rwanda had the extracting equipment to extract the essential oil, and then they would sell it to SC Johnson. So a beautiful, from the farmers to the government, to the company that needed this product. And it elevated all boats, if you will. We have video where the farmers, we interviewed them, and they said, we were able to send our kids to school, buy medicine, buy foods that we don't produce ourselves, meat and other kinds of things. That's kind of the formula that we have been following, is that value addition, okay, to engage with all of those entities, as Asma said very well, in a way that is productive and that is profitable, okay? But what was so good about Rwanda is that their government was stable. There's no perfect government, but, pretty good. They were one of our partners. The problem is when you go into a country where that's not the situation, where there's corruption, as Director Beasley said. How do you fix that? Those are the toughest places, really tough. And that's where you have to really think hard what policies can either government agencies like USAID or donor foundations like the Gates Foundation or whoever, what policies can they work on so that when they go into a country like that, they put down the conditions, if you will, that this is how we're going to help you, but this needs to happen. Now, some places, it just won't work, okay? There has to be, a greater force put on them, and I'm not smart enough to tell you what that'll take. But we work all over the world in various countries, and it's a formula that works better in some places than others because the corruption in the government is really the key. That's the hardest obstacle to get over. So,
Thank you. And we'll circle back to, I want to hear more about your work in Afghanistan as well. But before we do that, Victor, what's the connection between migration and these issues that we're dealing with? Tell us about your work at the Baylor Collaborative and the kinds of initiatives that you're trying to develop here at Baylor.
Thanks, and I echo my gratitude to the event sponsors and for the invitation to be here, to be part of what I hope is the first of a series of these conversations. Sure, so what we're trying to do at the Collaborative is take this model that Jeremy and the team have developed over the years, and now adapt that work and do this kind of work internationally. And the first place that we're trying to do that work is in the Central American child and family refugee crisis. It's a crisis that you see on the front pages of the newspapers, and to those of us that live in Texas, it's especially relevant for us today. So since about 2014, more than 1 million children and families have left Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and they've come to the United States and requesting asylum in the US. And about half of those are what you hear called the unaccompanied minors. And an unaccompanied minor is a child who made that journey unaccompanied by their parents, right? A child who made that journey alone. And what we're trying to do is understand, why are those folks leaving? What do they experience along the way? And then what are their challenges and opportunities present themselves once they get to the United States? And at the beginning of the crisis, most of that migration was driven by violence. And that's still an issue, and as Governor Beasley said today so powerfully, food insecurity and violence are intimately related. But what we know now is that the last several years, the primary driver of these child and family refugees is hunger and food insecurity. Guatemala has one of the world's highest rates of child malnutrition, and cases of acute child malnutrition in Guatemala doubled in just 1 year, from 2019 to 2020. Governor Beasley and the World Food Program tell us that more than 1 million people in these 3 countries alone are in emergency food insecurity. And these folks have, in many cases, already taken emergency steps to meet their food needs. What I mean is, they've borrowed money from friends and family. They sold their land to buy food. They've done all that, and they're still food insecure. And so for many families, migration seems like, it doesn't seem like, right? For many families, migration is the only option that they have. And so we can talk about the causes of that hunger, but fundamentally the relationship between hunger and migration is that hunger drives people to leave. So,
as Governor Beasley, or Asma, you mentioned earlier, in the early 2000s, the UN set goals to reduce poverty, and not only did they meet the goals, they exceeded them. That made us all very optimistic. But even before COVID hit, those numbers began to move in the wrong direction. We began to see a rise once again in poverty and hunger. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about why that is the case, and then perhaps tell us how COVID has impacted those numbers as much as we understand at this point.
So the poverty numbers, I believe, stayed relatively the same over the last few years. But what has happened since 2014 is we've seen a steady increase in hunger. Somebody referred to the UN report, the state of food and insecurity. That report over the last several years has tried to unpack what are some of the drivers of this rise in hunger. And they point to 3 factors: climate change, conflict, and Director Beasley spoke a lot about conflict, and economic disruption. So any economic change that a country experiences, let's say the price of the mineral that they export drops or something like that, can trigger a rise in hunger. And over the last 5 years, you've seen these 3 drivers really interacting with each other, in fact. So it's hard to isolate and say this is happening because of climate change or this is happening because of conflict. The conflict might be happening because people are unable to work their land anymore and have had to move. And when they move, it disrupts the communities in which they've moved into, that can either trigger conflict or can create dissatisfaction, frustration that the unsavory groups can take advantage of. Economic crises can be triggered by climate disruptions. So the year that we had the food price crisis in 2007, 2008, there were several events unrelated to each other in Russia, in Australia, where there had been a disruption to food production that led to this global spike in food prices. So these were events that were happening separately, but the cumulative effect was a rise in food prices. And for poor families, low-income families, food is a huge percentage of their budget. In developing countries, I think it's estimated that 60% of the budget, household budget, goes to food. So if the price of food goes up even a small amount, it affects both the quality of the food that they're consuming and then eventually the quantity. And for children, especially in that critical 1,000 days between a mother's pregnancy and her child's second birthday, if a child is malnourished for an extended period of time during that 1,000 days, it can do permanent damage that can't be undone later in life, and so leading to stunting. And so it's really important that we look at all of these issues and the drivers in a holistic way, because otherwise we're not creating the right policy tools or interventions or programs that can adequately address the problem.
Elsa, did you want to chime in?
I did. Thank you for your remarks, because it made me want to tell you about climate change for sure has impacted the ability of farmers in various parts of the world to produce what they normally produce. And one excellent example, and Victor, can certainly attest to this. Several years ago, when the migration of people, especially initially children, from Central America coming up to Texas started because there had been some conditions in the climate of that zone that had affected farmers. One specific group, and again, coffee, because as I said to you, it's an important crop for developing countries. There had been really the humidity as well as the temperature range, the lows and the highs in that region in Central America had changed to the extent that they made it very easy for a specific organism, a fungus, that kills the coffee plant to grow really well. And so that coffee fungus, it's called roya in Spanish, just started wiping out all their crops. And think about it this way, coffee, it takes about 4 years or so for a coffee plant to grow to maturity so you can then pick the coffee cherries and the beans inside. Imagine you're one of these farmers, and after 1 year that you're watching your crop grow, here comes a fungus, wipes you out. You gotta plant again. Maybe a couple of years go by, here comes a fungus, wipes you out again. 3 years have gone by, you got nothing, okay? So pretty soon you're gonna be thinking, what am I gonna do? I have to feed my family. We have to get out of here. And so we worked with some scientists in a research center in France, actually, and helped develop a variety of coffee called Centro Americano that is resistant to the fungus. So we were able to plant it in 2018 when we started a project funded by USAID. And this particular variety of coffee not only is resistant to the fungus, but it grows in 3 years. Okay, so faster and more beans per plant. Make a long story short, when the farmers were able to do their harvest, actually 2017 is when we planted it, in 2020 is when they were able to reap their harvest, and we have them on video saying, we don't have to leave. That's amazing. And it's a project where we trained about 25,000 farmers, but there's a lot more to go, a lot more to go. And that's just that one issue. Imagine if you're a farmer growing something else that was also affected. So the key here is, how do we get ahead of this, okay? We were reacting to the climate situation and luckily developed a variety that was resistant, but it took years and people were suffering. How do we get ahead of the curve? How do we mitigate as much as we can, as Asma said, climate change episodes? How do we do it? And one of the things that we know is that agriculture is the key, because when you produce certain crops, you capture carbon emissions. And it's the carbon emissions that scientists tell us is what causes, all the different changes in the climate. So effective and efficient agricultural production in the right way can actually be a way for us to mitigate those changes. So isn't that something worth investing in? I would think so. I think food companies, agricultural companies all over the world are very interested in that, investing in something like that. And why not do it in countries where agriculture is of extreme importance, because without it, people will starve to death.
We had a Zoom conversation last week. And speaking of technology and Zoom, we were talking, and Victor was very excited about this coffee bean. And so perhaps
I'm just excited about coffee. So.
Well, this is a conflicting conversation my students and I have in class together about our love of coffee. Why don't you talk a little bit about why this is so exciting to you? I mean, tell me about how, in terms of your questions of migration and the crisis that we are seeing here on our border, development of a coffee bean, like Elsa is describing, like how is this, do you see part of the hopeful work that we have before us in terms of preventing migration?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the themes that has emerged, at least for me today, is how all of this is connected and how we really have to get out of our silos. And I know the academics saying get out of our silos, how ironic is that, right? But we have to get out of our silos and do this work together and in conversation with one another. So one of the drivers of the hunger, which is the driver of migration, is global climate change. And one of the challenges is training farmers to grow new crops in new ways. And this is why I'm so excited about the work that Elsa and her team are doing, because that's one of those, for me, hopeful signs of what can happen when we make these kinds of changes. What folks don't realize, I appreciate Asma saying that food is such an important part of a family's budget. The other challenge that American audiences don't realize is that when food production suffers, at least in the part of the world I study, employment suffers, right? So the agriculture sector is 30% of employment in Central America. So when there are no crops, when their crops fail, people lose their jobs, which further exacerbates this cycle of unemployment or underemployment and systemic hunger and poverty, which again further fuels the migration. And so, earlier, Governor Beasley talked about the folks at the World Food Program are providing food, but they're also engaged in conflict resolution, which is right. And our conflict resolution folks are also engaged in anti-hunger work. We just didn't really realize that. It's just exciting to me to see the possibilities of food scientists and economists and agronomists, and I hope there's room for a political scientist or two at the table to have this kind of conversation. Because in addition to getting farmers the technology that they need to grow these new crops in these new ways, we have to address things like credit markets, and we have to address things like the infrastructure to get product to market, either domestically or internationally. We have to address things like state capacity, especially local and municipal governments, to give governments the capacity to enact these kinds of changes. And so I think there's a lot we can do, both on the technical side, but there's even more that we can do on the policy side and on the implementation side to do this work. So this is really exciting.
Okay, so I'm going to throw this question out to the three of you. Because it follows with what you're saying. We've heard Governor Beasley say several times that food is the pathway to peace, that food is the way in which we can prevent conflict. And yet we know historically, and particularly in Latin America, well, not singularly in Latin America, but in Latin America, we have seen food weaponized, that food becomes itself the means for control in governments, and who gets to call the shots and how things are done. So how do we solve this world problem here? How do we prevent the weaponization of food?
Well, let me just start very quickly, because I know we don't have much time. I was fascinated, and I completely agree, because we also had some projects in Afghanistan, and I can tell you that's a country that cannot catch a break. Extremely hardworking people, the farmers, the producers. We were there trying to help them with horticulture crops, with livestock production, and then the world came to an end, if you will, for them. But ISIS, as he said, absolutely uses the need for food to recruit people, to sway people in one way or the other. So the more we can do to help people become independent of those forces, so that they can track their own path by being, farmers that produce what they need to produce to earn money and not have to depend on somebody else providing them their food or their money. That's clearly the path forward.
I would say, I think the opportunity for food to become weaponized is when society has completely broken down. So preventing that has to be our number one goal. And I think we need to think about, we need to stop calling what we do as aid. It is really an investment. It's an investment in people. It's an investment in enabling them to live life to their full potential with dignity. And it's an investment in a prosperous global economy where everybody has more equal opportunity to engage in economic activity. I think we tend to go in after it's too late. And we really need to start to become smarter. And I think with the Sustainable Development Goals, there's an opportunity to look at issues in a more holistic way, in a more systems way, to get smarter about anticipating where are the fault lines, and how can we preemptively intervene so that it doesn't turn into a conflict, because the conflict is actually far more expensive. Just on Iraq, on Afghanistan, $1 trillion a year we've spent, or something like that. It's just a crazy amount of money. The most recent estimates, to end hunger, which is Sdg2, is an additional $30 billion a year. Compare that to the trillions that we're spending on conflict. So I think we have to change the way we think and take steps to really analyze things in a more comprehensive way, looking at root causes, and do a true cost accounting before we, it's too easy to let the difficult problems slide and deal with them later. But up front, it lowers the cost tremendously. It's sort of like preventative medicine or preventative health.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think we need, and this is something that we three of us were talking about at lunch, we need to think proactively and long-term. So, Jenny, you said in Latin America, conflict is around land and food, and that's right. And we know that that's coming because historically in Latin America, conflict has been around who gets to control the good, fertile land. And how does that get used? Well, what do we know is happening with climate change is that there's less fertile land, and in fact, some places are going to become uninhabitable. So those conflicts are going to intensify as there's less fertile land, and now we're going to be fighting over those. So we know it's coming. We have to think proactively, but we also have to think long term. These crises have been decades in the making, and it's going to take a long time to address them. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for policymakers. Policymakers have very short time horizons because they have elections every 2 years. Nonprofits have short time horizons because we need to show our donors results right now. Understandably, our donors need to see that their money is going to good things. And yet, one of the challenges is to expand our time horizons because, again, the situation that we're in was decades in the making. It's going to take us a while to address those challenges. So what I would hope is that we begin to think proactively, not reacting to crises, but also let's think about these long-term steps that we can take to address these issues. And again, as you heard Jeremy say earlier today, none of us can do this alone. I think we can do it together. But it is going to take the business sector, the nonprofit sector, the academic sector, the researchers, the advocates, the analysts, the food scientists, all working, quite intentionally working together to address these issues.
Yeah, and here's the challenge, right, is you're talking about long-term, proactive, preemptive kind of work while we're dealing with tremendous crises at the same time, right? Okay, so I'm getting the warning that time is up. Do I have time for one more question, or do I need? Okay, so my last question. Tell us what is hopeful. Tell us, this is for all three of you, tell us where you see signs of hope in the work that you are doing.
I'm going to just make it very brief here and give you an example. The continent of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa really, huge, okay? And they've had lots of issues for years and years. So every country is different and so forth. Well, there's something called the African Union. It's an institution that is trying to unite all of the different regional economic communities and countries within sub-Saharan Africa because they get it, that if they don't work together, the continent will never rise out of poverty and hunger. Specific individual countries might, but not as a whole. And why is that important? For many reasons that we have stated, but they're doing it through trade. They realize that as a continent, my goodness, they have incredible natural resources. They can produce a lot of agricultural products. If they ever get their act together, watch out, because they're going to be super competitive in the marketplace, trading with other countries and supplying, whether it's China or Europe or even the US, with whatever crops or other agricultural production commodities that we may need. And so if they need to get their act together, so we're helping them draft a strategy on how to do that, how to comply with global standards of food safety so they can engage in trade of those commodities. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be done overnight. But they finally have realized they need to get their act together. We're helping them do that. Hopefully it'll be something that we can all work on here as expeditiously as possible. And then watch out, because then that brings income to those countries. And provided it doesn't go into the pockets of dictators, then things can change.
I'll pick up where you left off. Africa really gives me hope. I've been, just earlier this week, I organized a session on Zoom on smallholder farmers. And we had groups of smallholder farmers join the call from all over Africa, women smallholder farmers. And first of all, they made it there to to join this session. They were there with their masks, all eager to engage in this conversation around smallholder farmers. It was really exciting to see. And then the conversation we had, this was at the Alliance for Green Revolution Forum. It was really exciting to see the conversation about, what needs to happen and from their own experience to lift smallholder farmers out of hunger and poverty in Africa. So one thing that several things give me hope. I'm an advocate, so I'm a natural optimist, but over the last, 10 years, I've seen country governments really step up, develop national nutrition strategies, try and implement national nutrition strategies, try to get the donors to support them, recognizing that childhood malnutrition is key to their future economic growth. That was a conversation that wasn't happening 10 years ago. Finance ministers, agriculture ministers, recognizing that this is a priority. I think civil society has played a tremendous role in pushing governments, and so that dialogue between different stakeholders at country level, that's really key. The SDGs and the conversation that they have triggered around systems and the need to look holistically at things, that gives me hope. We have, for the first time, the UN Food Systems Summit coming up in a couple of weeks in New York. That's the first time we've ever had a global conversation around food systems and how we can transform food systems to deliver better, healthier diets, more sustainably, and more equitably. That's an important conversation. And if that's the only thing that comes out of that summit, that will already have changed the mindset and culture. So that's really exciting as well. And I think young people, youth, everywhere. I mean, I think Governor Beasley talked about how we can use the technologies. We can use our phones for good and for bad. But the connectivity between young people all over the world, I think, has the potential to break down barriers, to start conversations, to find common ground, because that's ultimately, I think, the real value of this technology is it can help us transcend some of the differences that we have and find that common ground. So I'm hopeful on a number of levels. I'm not Pollyanna-ish. I think it's important to remain hopeful. I don't think we have a choice, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks for that question, Jenny. What gives me hope is that I actually think the migration conversation is starting to change. I think we're starting to ask why people migrate, and we're starting to talk about push factors. Instead of demonizing migrants and telling them not to come, we're asking them, why are they coming? Look, nobody wants to migrate. And the people I study in Central America, they know what it's going to be like. They know about the beast, the La Bestia, the train that they ride. They know how horrible the journey through Mexico is. No one wants to take it, and by golly, nobody wants to send their kid on that journey by themselves, right? So they do it because they have to. I have a pastor friend who always gets mad because in the academic world and in the policy world, we talk about push factors, right? The things that push people to migrate. He says, Victor, the refugees I work with, they weren't pushed, they were thrown, right? They had to leave or they would be killed. And as Governor Beasley said earlier today, every single one of us would have made that same choice, right? Given the choice that these families face, we'd all make that choice for our kids, right? So what gives me hope is that we're having a conversation about why people leave and what we can do to create conditions in these sending countries so that people can live in dignity and in safety. And once we've shifted that conversation, I think we can really begin to address it. And so that's what's given me hope. We can finally get to the work that we need to do.
Well, at the risk of sounding cheesy, you three give me hope. So thank you so much for your discussion today. Would you join me in thanking our panel?
We've been in the presence of some awesome people today. Can I get an amen? All right, that was excellent. Well, I want to thank our presenters and sponsors and our speakers today. What a wonderful day, and a lot of learning. I don't know about you, but I feel like I need to go to Cameron Park and just let it absorb me. I need to give it a day to let it all simmer. But what wonderful remarks. Thank you for the work that you do to help us bend the world towards justice. And I'm grateful to get to know you as a partner and a friend, and I would encourage you all before they leave to get their business cards and get to know them. These are tremendous individuals who are animated by their faith for the cause of justice. Well, I want to thank Truett Seminary for hosting us and being a great partner today. Special thanks to the World Food Program team, specifically David Austin, who worked with Grace Norman to help plan this event. To Director Beasley for his great remarks and for his source of inspiration for us all. I also want to thank Van Hipp. Van is one of our friends from DC. Van, wave to everybody. Van is the one who helped make this connection for us all. So Van and Governor Beasley go way back, and Van has been working with us as a university to try to help us move towards our Research 1 and Tier 1 goals. And he's been a tremendous partner and ally there in DC. And so he helped make this connection happen. So Van, thank you for doing that. Also for my good friend Max Finberg, you can probably trace almost all of your relationships and friendships back to 2 or 3 people, at least I can. And Max Finberg is a good friend of mine who worked at the World Food Program for a long time. He and David Austin have worked together at a variety of organizations. They worked with Ambassador Hall when he was serving as ambassador in Rome. And so he also helped make these introductions for us. So we're grateful. Before we leave, Grace Norman and Joy Springer, of course, are standing in the back, and this event would not have happened without them. So please join me in thanking them for putting this together today. Grace serves as our Chief of Staff and Director of External Relations. Joy serves with our institutional events, and the 2 of them tag team a great event. And so we're grateful for your work this week. Well, I want to leave us with this. Most of us are familiar with Jesus' teachings, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a migrant and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. This is the only end-of-the-world scene in the Gospel of Matthew, and Jesus has returned as the King. All people are gathered, and Jesus begins to separate them, the sheep and the goats, the righteous from the accused. To the astonishment of the people gathered, the criterion for judgment wasn't confession of faith in Christ. Nothing was said of grace, justification, or the forgiveness of sins. Instead, what mattered was whether or not a person had acted with love and cared for the needy. These acts weren't just extra credit, but they constituted the decisive criterion for judgment. Essentially, when people responded or failed to respond to human need, they were in fact responding or failing to respond to Christ. Matthew calls us not only to see the hungry as humans, but to see the hungry as Jesus. So together, we repent for our collective scapegoating, our indifference, and our lack of imagination. And together, we remember our brothers and sisters in poverty who live as strangers in our kingdoms. And together we will put flesh on the words of Jesus. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. Thank you for coming. Go in peace.
Hi, y'all. I'm Joaquin Castro, and I represent the people of San Antonio, Texas, in the United States House of Representatives. And it's great to join Baylor University today. I've been very impressed with Baylor's work over the years to address hunger. From the Texas Hunger Initiative to now this collaborative on hunger and poverty, Baylor University is leading the way in Texas and around the world to ensure that everybody has 3 healthy meals a day. Look, this is a personal issue for me and for many folks. Growing up with my brother, my mother, and my grandmother, there were times when our family was short on food. I come from a community of humble and hardworking families who sometimes struggle. Folks in San Antonio don't ask a lot from their government, but they do expect their government to address challenges that we can only overcome together. Hunger is one of humanity's oldest and greatest challenges. Y'all will remember the picture at the start of the pandemic of food lines in San Antonio. Lines and lines of cars waiting in a packed parking lot for food. These were hardworking people who overnight found themselves unable to afford their next meal. These families were one disaster, one paycheck away from poverty. And of course, it's not only San Antonio. Across Texas, over 4 million people are facing hunger, including 1 in 5 children. Thankfully, this Congress and the Biden administration have taken unprecedented action to ensure all Americans have enough to eat. For example, as part of the American Rescue Plan, Congress created the Pandemic EBT program so children who receive free or reduced lunch at school won't go hungry while learning virtually from home. And just last month, the Biden administration announced the largest increase to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, on record. Average benefits will rise more than 25% from pre-pandemic levels. That means more money in the pockets of families in need and less hunger in America. And while we address hunger here at home in the United States, as the richest nation on earth, we also have a responsibility to tackle global hunger. I serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm the chair of the Subcommittee on International Development. Combating global hunger and extreme poverty is a top priority. We work closely with the UN World Food Program, and I've had the opportunity to meet several times with Executive Director David Beasley, who's a strong champion in this fight. I've also held multiple hearings on the negative impacts of COVID on nutrition and health. Years of progress on food security has been erased by COVID, meaning the United States must redouble our efforts at home and around the world to end global hunger. I'm your partner in Congress, including on the Global Malnutrition Prevent and Treatment Act, which is a solid start. I'm also incredibly proud of the work being done by Baylor University, convening this forum and demonstrating to the world that Texas is a global leader in the fight to end hunger in our communities and around the globe. It's inspiring, and it gives me great hope for the future. Thank you, and please reach out to my office anytime.